In the spring of 2009, a county assessor's agent drove his white sedan up a gravel track in the hill country of Amador County, California, and found Clem Bodine standing at the edge of 37 acres of dead grapevines. The agent had a clipboard and a legal notice and a polite but final way of saying what the notice already said in plain language. The back taxes were past due, the estate had been abandoned, and the county intended to reclaim the parcel by the following October, if no one stepped in. He looked at the vines, at the rusted frost cables collapsed between the rows, at the topsoil channeled into little orange scars by 3 winters of erosion, and then he looked at Clem with the quiet, faintly compassionate expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis to someone who already knew it. Clem Bodine was 44 years old, a former tractor mechanic from Sutter Creek who had never made wine in his life. Clem paid the back taxes. The sum came to $11,400, and it bought him 37 acres of what the County Viticulture Extension Office, in a letter the following January, signed by a degreed specialist named Dale Voss, described as non-viable acreage unsuited to commercial viticultural recovery. Voss had a master's degree from UC Davis and had written the Extension Office's standard guidance on wine grape disease remediation. He was not wrong by the measurements available to him. The vines were dead, or nearly so. The soil was compacted and depleted. The drainage was compromised. The region's commercial winemakers, the ones with investors and new oak barrels and tasting rooms on Highway 49, had not bid on the parcel for a reason. 3 harvests later, in the fall of 2012, a buyer from a San Francisco wine brokerage stood in those same rows and paid $4,200 for a single case of 12 bottles. He did not negotiate the price. He stood in the vineyard for a long time first, looking at the vines, before he said anything at all. Let me tell you what was in those rows that the county assessor's agent could not see in 2009, because the answer to that question is the reason this story exists. Clem Bodine was known for 2 things in Sutter Creek. He was known for being hard to rattle, and he was known for fixing equipment that other mechanics gave up on. 44 years of that kind of attention will teach a person something about the difference between dead and dormant, about the difference between a system that has failed and a system that has been starved. Clem had spent 3 years before the tax auction, quietly walking the perimeter of the Bodine parcel, which had no family connection to him despite the name, learning what the fence rows and the drainage patterns and the old vine stock were telling him in a language that did not appear in Dale Voss's extension guidance. What he found, once he began pulling dead wood and cutting back the worst of the collapsed canopy, was old vine Zinfandel, not grafted modern rootstock. Original California field blend material, some of it 100 years in the ground, the surviving root systems running 8 and 10 feet deep into the Amador County clay loam, where the moisture stayed when the surface baked dry. The University of California Viticulture program had, by 2009, fairly well established that deep-rooted old vine stock produced dramatically lower yields of dramatically more concentrated fruit. But that knowledge was theoretical, pointing toward premium plantings in approved appellations, not pointing toward 37 acres of legally abandoned property that looked from the road like a thorn orchard. Dale Voss had looked at the canopy. Clem Bodine looked at the roots. Let me tell you about what old vine root architecture means for a wine grape, because you cannot understand what happened in those 3 harvests without it. A young grafted Zinfandel vine, planted on modern virus-resistant rootstock in the first decade of this century, typically sent its feeding roots into the top 18 inches of soil. That zone was where the commercial inputs went: the nitrogen, the sulfur, the fungicide, the drip irrigation. It was also the zone that baked dry in a California summer and required consistent maintenance to remain viable. The vine was, in a real mechanical sense, dependent on that maintenance to survive. It was efficient inside the system its growers had built for it, and it was fragile outside of it. An old vine Zinfandel that had been in Amador County grounds since before the First World War had no relationship with the top 18 inches. It had spent decades finding water and mineral nutrition at depth, in the clay loam subsoil where the roots converted the soil's iron-rich geology directly into flavor compounds that younger, shallower vines could not reach. The yield was low, sometimes less than a ton per acre, where a commercial planting might yield 3 or 4. The flavor concentration was something else entirely. Clem had walked enough of the old vine districts in Amador and El Dorado counties to have tasted the difference, though he could not have explained the chemistry in a seminar room. He also knew something about the field blend tradition, and this is where the second dimension of what he had bought began to matter. Old California field blend viticulture was not a romantic choice. It was a functional one. The Italian and Croatian immigrant families who planted these hillside vineyards in the 1880s and 1890s planted mixed varieties in the same rows, partly because varietal purity was a secondary concern, and partly because a diversified planting hedged against the specific disease and weather vulnerabilities of any single variety. The Bodine parcel had Zinfandel as its dominant variety, but it also had a scattering of Carignan, Alicante, Boucher, and what Clem's eventual viticulture consultant, a retired winemaker named Paul Rusk, identified as a small block of Trousseau Noir, a Jura variety that had arrived with French Basque settlers in the 1890s and survived the Prohibition era in California's hill country by sheer botanical stubbornness. To the commercial buyers surveying the Amador region in 2009 and 2010, a mixed variety parcel with no modern infrastructure was an asset class with no liquidity. To Clem, who had read enough about the old vine movement in Lodi and the Shenandoah Valley to understand that the market for this category was beginning a slow rotation from curious to coveted, it was the only kind of thing worth risking $11,000 on. Dale Voss visited the property in March of 2010, 14 months after Clem had paid the back taxes and begun his preliminary cutting back and soil work program. He arrived in a white university-marked pickup with the Davis seal on the door, wearing a clean canvas field jacket and carrying a soil probe he did not end up using. He walked the rows with Clem for about 40 minutes, moving carefully between the cut stumps of the worst collapsed canopy material, pausing twice to crouch and examine the vine crowns where the surviving canes had emerged from the old wood. Voss knew his vine pathology. He identified 2 distinct canker patterns in the Zinfandel rows and noted them in his field book with the practiced shorthand of a man who had written the extension guidance on these diseases. He was not dismissive on the walk. He asked good questions about Clem's pruning decisions and listened to the answers without interrupting. There were 2 graduate students with him, a young woman named Britt, who was working on drought stress physiology, and a young man whose name Clem never caught. And both of them were taking photographs of the canopy structure and the soil surface, and the old graft unions where the survivors met the clay. It was the assessment in the parking area that changed the register. Voss stood beside his pickup and summarized what he had seen, methodically and without cruelty. The root systems that remained were too compromised by the canopy dieback and the soil compaction to produce commercial quality fruit within any economically reasonable time frame, in his judgment. The soil structure would need significant remediation before the nutrient and moisture pathways were sufficient to support productive growth. 3 years was the window Clem had given himself in the plan he had written on a legal pad the previous January. Voss thought 3 years was not enough to see a single productive harvest from a property in this condition. He said this as a fact, the way he would have set a soil pH reading, not to wound. Son, he said, not unkindly, and Clem was 45 by then, so the word carried a particular texture. What you got here is a sentimental project. I don't say that to be hard on you, but you should go in with your eyes open about what the land can give you. Britt, the graduate student, glanced at the rows they had just walked and then at her notebook, not saying anything. The young man was downloading photographs onto a tablet on the truck's tailgate. Clem watched the whole scene with the same quiet he brought to most things and did not argue, because Voss was working from the best available data as he understood it, and the data Clem was working from was in the ground rather than in any protocol Voss had a form for. Clem thanked him for the visit. He meant it. Dale Voss had driven an hour and a half on a cold March morning to tell a tractor mechanic from Sutter Creek the truth as he understood it, which was a real kindness, and not every county extension officer bothered. He went back to work. The neighbor across the county road was a man named Gary Pryor, and Gary's path through the same years was worth watching for what it showed about the other choice available to a person with 30-odd acres of Amador County hillside and some appetite for risk. Gary had bought into a new vineyard development in 2008, 42 acres of freshly planted Cabernet Sauvignon on a certified weed suppression and drip irrigation program. The planting had cost him $94,000 in capital improvement loans at a commercial rate, plus a marketing arrangement with a regional label house that contracted his fruit at a per-ton price subject to quality scoring. Gary's operation was clean, properly certified, and staffed by the same kind of credentialed advisors who had written the playbook Clem was being told to follow. Gary's first full production harvest came in 2011. The label house graded his fruit at a per-ton price of $940, which was the going rate for young Cabernet Sauvignon from an Amador County planting without a documented old vine pedigree. Gary ran the numbers on a Saturday evening at his kitchen table, and they came out, after debt service and input costs, to a margin of about $1,200 for the year. He did not say anything to Clem about that number because Gary was not a man who complained, and the debt was still manageable, and the vines were young, and the advisors said year 3 was where the quality and the pricing both began to improve. Clem's first harvest, in the fall of 2010, produced just under 3 tons of fruit from the 37 acres, which was a yield of less than 1/10 of a ton per acre from the vines that had responded well enough to produce it all. He and Paul Rusk sorted the fruit by hand on 2 long plywood tables in the equipment shed. The shed had bare timber walls and a single row of fluorescent fixtures that threw a flat blue-white light over everything, and the 2 of them worked through each bin, 1 cluster at a time, sorting damaged fruit from sound fruit with the same concentrated silence of people doing a thing they believe in. The sorting took 2 full days. The good fruit went into the concrete tanks, which Clem had spent the previous spring cleaning with a wire brush and sealing with a food-grade epoxy he had mixed himself according to a 40-year-old specification he found in Paul Rusk's files. What came out of those tanks after primary fermentation was pressed into glass demijohns that Clem borrowed from a neighboring property and stored in the lower room of the main equipment shed, which stayed at 54 degrees through the winter without any mechanical assistance because the shed was built into the north-facing hillside. 461 bottles. Paul Rusk said it was the most interesting wine he had made in 15 years, and he had not technically made it, which was his way of saying something significant about the fruit itself. Clem sold 212 of those bottles locally, at a price of $38 each, to restaurants and a single wine shop in Jackson and Plymouth. He kept the rest and spent the winter reading everything Paul Rusk would lend him about native yeast fermentation and extended maceration, which were the techniques the old field blend tradition had relied on before the laboratory wine era standardized them away. The reading and the thinking and the conversations with Paul over the equipment shed's propane heater were, in Clem's accounting, the most important work of that first year. The wine was what it was. The understanding of why it was, that was what the next harvest would require. Gary Pryor came by in November of 2010 and tasted the first harvest wine from a glass Clem offered him and said it was very good, and then he asked what Clem planned to do about the 40% of his vines that had not produced anything. Clem said he planned to wait and see what the cover crop program did to the soil structure over the coming year, and then cut back again in the spring. Gary said that seemed like a reasonable patience to have if you could afford it, and Clem said the back taxes were the only debt on the property, and the local restaurant sales had covered those inside the first harvest, so patience was the cheapest input he had. Gary thought about that on the drive home. It was a different kind of math than the math his advisors were running, and Gary was honest enough to sit with the difference rather than dismiss it. Dale Voss heard about the first harvest through the extension network and sent a brief note acknowledging it. He was polite, and he was correct, technically, that a yield of less than 3 tons on 37 acres was not commercially viable by any standard metric. He was not wrong. He was measuring what was easy to measure. The second harvest, fall of 2011, produced 7.5 tons from the Zinfandel rows that had responded to Clem's pruning and the previous year's cover crop work. The cover crop was important and deserves a moment's explanation, because it was where Clem deviated most sharply from the standard management playbook. Most commercial plantings in the region maintain clean rows, clear of competing vegetation, reasoning that weed competition reduced yield. Clem planted a mix of native grasses and crimson clover between his rows, a practice Paul Rusk had seen used on old Italian homestead vineyards in Amador County in the 1960s, and that the soil science literature, when Clem found his way to it, described as a method for improving water penetration, reducing compaction, and building the mycorrhizal fungal networks that old vine root systems use to extend their effective nutrient absorption radius far beyond the roots themselves. The clover fixed nitrogen. The grasses built organic matter. The fungal networks, which took a full season to establish, began connecting the old root systems to one another in a way that Clem's cover crop consultant, a soil biologist named Terry, described as a passive irrigation and nutrition delivery grid that required no input and no maintenance beyond not destroying it. To the commercial winemakers on Highway 49 who drove past Clem's rows and saw the weedy-looking mess between his vines, it looked like neglect. Gary Pryor mentioned it once, gently, because Gary was a considerate neighbor and genuinely thought Clem was behind on his weed work. Clem said the weeds were the point. Gary did not know what to do with that answer. The second harvest fruit went into the concrete tanks and into 4 French oak barrels that Clem had bought used for $300 apiece from a Napa producer who had rotated them out of his program after 3 uses. The wine from the second harvest was bottled in October of 2012, and it was, by then, not the same wine as the first harvest. Paul Russ tasted it from the barrel in February of that year and sat very still for a moment before he said anything. "Clem," he said, "this has got something in it." Gary Pryor's second harvest, same fall of 2011, came in at 3 tons per acre on his Cabernet planting, which was a solid number. The label house scored the fruit and contracted it at $960 per ton. Gary's margin, after debt service and the chemical input costs that were running about $11,000 annually, came to just under $4,000 for the year. The advisors continued to say that year 3 was where the pricing improved. Then came the summer of 2012, and the summer of 2012 was very hot and very dry in a particular way that the Amador County hills had not seen in a concentrated stretch since the late 1970s. The heat arrived in mid-June and did not relent. By August, the county's weather station at Drytown was recording daily highs above 100 degrees on 22 consecutive days. The drip irrigation systems that kept young vine plantings alive in summer drought were running at capacity by the 3rd week of July, and by the 1st week of August, the water tables in these shallow-drilled supply wells that served several operations in the valley floor were beginning to drop. A property 2 miles east of Clem's pulled its irrigation water from a shared easement with another grower, and the sharing arrangement broke down in late July when the supply fell below the volume both parties needed, and the parties stopped being neighborly about it in the way people stop being neighborly when water becomes scarce and lawyers become the next available option. Gary's drip system ran from a shallow well that he had drilled to 60 feet in 2008. By August 14th, the pump was pulling air on cycles. He rented a water truck and hauled water for 11 days while he waited for a well driller to come out and advise him on deepening the bore. The well driller's truck sat in Gary's driveway on a Wednesday in late August, while the two of them walked the planting together, and the driller spoke about hydrology and risk with the same careful tone that Dale Voss used when he was about to give someone an estimate they wouldn't want to hear. The driller quoted him $38,000 to go down another 100 feet, with any reasonable chance of finding sustained yield. Gary financed it. The driller hit decent water at 140 feet in the 1st week of September. The Cabernet fruit had been stressed through the drought period, the leaves showing scorch at the edges from the 3rd week of August onward. The berry development uneven in the way that heat-stressed vines produce when the vegetative system is prioritizing survival over reproduction. The label house's sampling crew came out in late September and scored it. The price dropped to $710 per ton. Gary's margin for 2012, after the well project, the water hauling, the debt service, and the chemical inputs, was a number he didn't share with anyone. But the look on his face in October was a number in itself. Clem's Vineyard had no drip irrigation system. The old vine Zinfandel roots were at depth, drawing from the clay loam moisture reservoir that the summer heat did not reach. The cover crops had held the topsoil through the first 3 weeks of the heat spell, and Clem had mowed them low in July to reduce competition, leaving the root mat intact to continue its moisture retention work underground. The vines showed some leaf curl in the worst of the August heat. They did not stop producing. The 3rd harvest, in late September and early October of 2012, produced 11 tons across the 37 acres from the Zinfandel rows that had fully returned, with an additional half-ton from the Carignan and the small trousseau block that Paul Rusk had decided to pick separately and ferment on its own. Clem and Paul and Gary's teenage son Kyle who had come over to help pick for 2 weeks, sorted the fruit on the plywood tables, and then on 2 additional tables Clem had borrowed from the church hall in Sutter Creek. And the sorting took 4 days. What went into the concrete tanks was the result of 4 days of quiet, careful hand selection by 3 people who did not rush. In November, a buyer named Marcus Shen arrived from a San Francisco wine brokerage that handled small production California labels. He had heard about the Bodine parcel from Paul Rusk's former employer, a Lodi winemaker who had tasted the second harvest wine at a regional trade event in Sacramento in late September. The Lodi winemaker had tasted it blind, not knowing what it was, and had said to the person next to him that he had no idea what appellation this fruit came from, but that whoever was growing it needed to be found immediately. Marcus Shen was the person next to him. Shen drove up on a Thursday morning in a plain, dark sedan. No university markings, no clipboard. He was 53 years old and had been buying small production California wine for 22 years, and he had the bearing of a man whose opinions had been right often enough that he no longer felt the need to explain them in advance. He walked the rows with Clem for 2 hours. He did not talk much during the walk. He asked to see the old vine material in the trousseau block, and he stood for a long time looking at the root crowns where they emerged from the clay soil, at the bark texture that said these plants were genuinely old, not replanted heritage selections on new root stock. He crouched and put his fingers into the soil in 2 places, rubbing the clay loam between his thumb and forefinger, and he looked at the cover crop root mat that was visible at the edge of the bare trench Clem had dug the previous week to look at a drainage issue. Then he went to the equipment shed and tasted from the second harvest barrel that Clem was still aging, a small pour from the bung port that Paul Rusk drew with a wine thief while Clem held the lamp steady. Marcus tasted it and stood with the glass and looked at the wall for a while. Then he tasted 3 samples of the third harvest fruit in early fermentation, drawn from the concrete tanks in small mason jars, and he tasted each one twice without speaking. He sat with his glass for a time that felt, to Clem, like a long time. Paul Rusk was on a stool at the far end of the table, and he did not speak either. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said. "What do you want to do with this place?" Clem said he wanted to keep making wine from it the way he'd been making wine from it. Marcus said, "Then I want to buy everything you'll sell me from this vintage and the next 2. They agreed on a price. The price for the small production bottling from the third harvest, which Clem and Paul designated as the estate's first named release, was $4,200 per case of 12 bottles. Paul Rusk set his mason jar down very carefully when the number was said. Marcus Shen did not change expression. He had come with a number in his mind, and it had been slightly lower than this one, but the trousseau samples had moved the number upward before he said anything, and he had learned 20 years ago not to negotiate against a product with no comparable. That number landed in the equipment shed on a November afternoon in 2012 with a silence that neither man broke for a while. The propane heater ticked in the corner. Outside, the dormant Zinfandel rose ran up the hill in the last of the day's amber light, the old crown wood dark against the pale grass of the cover crop. The case price was $4,200, $11,400 in back taxes. 3 years, $4,200 for 12 bottles. Dale Voss heard about Marcus Shen's visit through the Extension Network, as he heard about most things in the Amador County wine community, and he drove out to the Bodine parcel in December of 2012 on a cold, bright morning and walked with Clem through the dormant rows. He was 61 years old by then and had spent 30 years advising wine grape producers in the Sierra foothills. He stood for a while at the old trousseau block, looking at the vine crowns, and then he turned to Clem and said, "I underestimated what was in the ground here." Clem said he thought that was a reasonable thing to have done, given what the ground looked like in 2009. Voss said, "How are you managing the mycorrhizal networks in the cover crop system?" He was asking, not correcting. The register had shifted completely, and Clem felt it shift, and he answered the question the same way he answered every question, plainly, and with the specific detail that the question deserved. They talked for an hour in the cold rose. When Dale Voss left, he took a copy of the soil biology study that Terry had written up from her sampling work on the parcel, and he said he would like to come back in the spring. He did come back. He came back 3 times in 2013, and by the 4th visit, he was bringing 2 graduate students from the Davis Viticulture program to walk the rows and look at the soil profiles that Clem's cover crop system had been building for 3 years. The Amador Old Vine community had been a loose, informal network before 2012. After the Marcus Shen purchase and the first national press mentions in early 2013, which named the Bodine parcel in a short item about Old Vine California field blends, the network became something more deliberate. 5 neighbors who held parcels with surviving Old Vine material came to Clem's equipment shed in February of 2013 and sat around the plywood tables and asked questions. 3 of them had been managing their Old Vine rows under the same conventional guidance that Dale Voss had offered Clem, with drip irrigation, clean rows, and standard input programs. 2 of them had pulled some of their Old Vine material in the 2000s to replant with modern certified stock. Clem described what he had done, section by section, and he described what Paul Rusk had taught him and what Terry's soil work had confirmed, and what 3 years of watching the vines had told him that none of it had fully prepared him to see. He did not perform this. He described it the same way he would describe replacing a hydraulic pump, carefully, with the specific steps in their correct order, because the specifics were the only part that mattered. Of the 5 neighbors, 4 tried some version of the cover crop and native yeast program on their own Old Vine blocks in 2013. Gary Pryor was one of them. Gary had decided in the winter of 2012 that he was going to take a portion of his Cabernet acreage and plant native grass cover crops between the rows the following spring. He said it to Clem in the driveway one December evening, matter-of-factly, and Clem said he was glad to hear it. Gary said the year with the well had clarified his thinking about shallow-rooted systems. Clem kept the operation at 37 acres. Marcus Shen came back for the 4th harvest purchase in 2013 with a standing offer that Clem could expand production through a contract growing arrangement with 2 nearby parcels whose owners were interested in supplying fruit to the Bodine label. Clem declined. He said that the soil biology he had spent 3 years building was specific to this ground, and that his ability to manage it the way it needed to be managed was limited by his own attention and Paul Rusk's, and that those limits were the actual boundaries of the operation. Marcus understood this. He had heard a version of it from every Old Vine producer he respected. The back taxes parcel that the county assessor's agent had carried a notice for in the spring of 2009 became, by 2014, the subject of a full-length study in a California wine journal, whose author spent 2 seasons walking the rows with Clem and Terry and Dale Voss. The study was about soil biology and Old Vine root architecture, and Clem was in it mostly as a source of observed detail rather than a quoted authority, which was how he preferred it. Paul Rusk retired from his consulting practice in 2015, and gave Clem his entire file of notes, vineyard observation logs, and hand-drawn soil profile maps from 30 years of Sierra foothills work. The files came in 4 cardboard boxes and took up most of the shelf space in the equipment shed. Clem read through all of them that winter, making his own notes in the margins in pencil, adding dates and measurements from the Bodine parcel's own records, building a composite document that he did not intend to publish or distribute. He intended to hand it to his nephew, a young man named Eli, who had finished a degree in environmental science in 2014 and had come to spend 2 weeks picking grapes and stayed through the winter and then through the following spring. Eli had arrived with some things he'd learned in college about sustainable land management and a general skepticism about whether an operation this small, producing fruit, this manually intensive, could remain economically coherent without scaling up. He had said as much to Clem in October of 2014, sitting in the equipment shed after a long day sorting fruit, with the kind of honest directness that a 23-year-old allows himself around an uncle who won't be offended. Clem listened. He did not argue. He handed Eli a glass of the Third Harvest wine from a bottle he'd opened for a visiting journalist the previous week and said, "Tell me what you think the land can give you at 50 acres and a drip system." Eli tasted the wine and was quiet for a moment. He turned the glass in his hand and looked at it, and there was a pause long enough that Clem did not try to fill it. The wine was not doing what Eli expected wine to do. He said he didn't know enough yet. Clem said, "That's the right answer." By the following spring, Eli was spending 6 days a week in the rows, arriving before Clem most mornings, and asking questions about the soil biology that led him, by summer, to Terry's office at the Extension office in Jackson, where he spent a month reading through the literature on mycorrhizal fungal networks and their role in old vine physiology. Terry lent him 4 papers and a book and answered his follow-up questions by email for 2 weeks before she suggested he come back in person, because the questions had gotten good enough that they deserved a longer conversation. He came back with a notebook full of questions and the beginning of a different way of understanding what 37 acres was doing and why. The crew that harvested the Bodine parcel in 2016, the 7th year since the back taxes payment, was Clem and Eli and 3 seasonal workers from the same family who had come back for the 4th consecutive fall. The yield from the Zinfandel rows had stabilized at roughly 1/3 of a ton per acre from the oldest wood, which was exactly where Paul Rusk's notes from the 1970s had suggested the deepest old vine stock in this district should stabilize once the soil biology was given time to reestablish itself around the root systems. The trousseau block, which had been one of the quiet revelations of the project, was producing fruit that Marcus Shen had begun selling separately to 2 San Francisco restaurants whose chefs had tasted it and refused to share their allocation with anyone else. One of those chefs had come out to the vineyard in September of 2015, a woman named Claire, who ran a kitchen in the Mission District and had driven 3 hours to stand in a row of 100-year-old trousseau vines in the Amador County hills and taste a grape off the cluster. She stood eating grapes and not saying anything for long enough that Clem wondered if something was wrong. She said finally, "This fruit is what the wine tastes like?" Clem said yes. She said, "Most fruit doesn't taste like the wine." Clem said he knew. That was the thing about old vine concentration. The chemistry was already present in the grape. The winemaking was mostly a matter of not interrupting it. Claire bought 12 cases for the restaurant and asked to be notified when the next vintage was ready. The parcel's back tax purchase price, $11,400, had been paid back from the first harvest's local sales. The subsequent harvests, at Marcus Shen's contracted case prices, had generated enough margin that the equipment shed's concrete floor now had 2 more fermentation tanks on it, bought used from a Sonoma producer who was upgrading, and that Eli's seasonal wages were paid, and the property taxes were current, and a small maintenance reserve was building in a savings account in Jackson. Clem did not call this wealth. Paul Rusk's notes from the 1970s sat on the shed shelf next to Clem's own observation logs and Eli's soil biology notebooks. The notebooks were the asset he thought about most. The wine was what the notebooks made possible. The county assessor's agent, who had driven up the gravel track in 2009, retired from the county in 2013, and sent Clem a note when he read the journal article in 2014. He said he was glad someone had found value in the parcel, because he had always thought it was a shame when old vine material was lost to erosion and neglect. He had known, driving up that track, that there was something older than it looked in those rows. He had not known what to do with that knowledge in the context of his clipboard and his notice. Clem kept the note in the shed. What the county had seen in those 37 acres was a liability with a dollar amount attached to it. $11,400 owed and unpaid. What the university's extension office had seen was a recovery timeline that exceeded commercial viability thresholds. Both of those readings were accurate. They were also measuring the only things either institution had a method for measuring. What was in the ground was not on any form those institutions maintained. This is the thing that old vine viticulture teaches, if you spend enough time with it, and it is not a lesson that arrives quickly. It arrives the way the old vines themselves arrive at depth, slowly, through years of working the same ground, past the zone where the inputs are, past the compaction layer, down into the clay loam where the moisture stays and the mineral world is patient and uninterrupted and entirely indifferent to the cost projections above it. The 2-event time bridge of this story, the gap between the county notice in 2009 and the Marcus Shen purchase in 2012, was 3 years. That is a short span, as these stories go. It was short because the material was already there, waiting for someone who knew how to look at roots rather than canopy, who knew the difference between a dead vine and a dormant one, who had spent 44 years learning that the most broken-looking thing in the room is frequently the one with the most structural integrity. Dale Voss visited the Bodine parcel for the last time in the spring of 2018, accompanied by Eli and 2 doctoral students who were writing a dissertation chapter on pre-prohibition field blend viticulture in the Sierra foothills. He was 67 by then and had retired from the extension office the previous fall. He walked slowly through the old Zinfandel rows with a soil probe, taking samples at various depths, and he stopped in the trousseau block and stood looking at the vine crowns for a long time. He said, to no one in particular, that the fungal network density visible in the probe sample from this block was the most developed he had seen in 40 years of Sierra foothills soil work. He said that this ground had been managed by someone who understood what they were trying to build before the science had a full accounting of it. Eli wrote that down in his notebook. The vines that had looked like thorn hedges in the spring of 2009 were now the oldest continuously managed old vine Zinfandel block in Amador County's documented viticultural record. The trousseau block was older still. Neither distinction was the point exactly. The point was that someone had looked at an apparent ruin and recognized a patient system that had simply been waiting for the right kind of attention. 5 acres of Clem's ground, $11,000 in back taxes, $4,200 for 12 bottles, and a shelf full of notebooks in an equipment shed in Sutter Creek, building toward the generation that would know how to read them. The deepest roots are always the last thing a clipboard finds, but they are also when the surface dries out and the pumps begin to fail and the conventional path starts calculating its losses, the only thing left standing. Eli turned out the light in the shed each evening and left the notebooks on their shelf. The vines outside the window did not require his attention tonight. They were down in the clay loam doing what they had been doing for 100 years, which was the same thing they would be doing 100 years from now if someone kept the cover crops alive between the rows and left the roots alone to find their own water. That is what the ground here gives you if you know how to ask.